For nearly 80 years, the story of D-Day has been told from one side, the story of Allied triumph, bravery, and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. But what was it like on the other side of the beach? How did the German soldiers, dug into their concrete bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, experience the largest amphibious invasion in history? Today, we're going to look at the Normandy landings from the often overlooked German perspective. By the spring of 1944, the German High Command knew an Allied invasion of Western Europe was coming. The only questions were where and when. The tension was immense. Every day that passed without an attack was another day of waiting, another day of strained nerves. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme commander in the West, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, were tasked with defending a coastline that stretched for thousands of miles. But these two brilliant commanders had a fundamental disagreement that would prove fatal. Von Rundstedt believed the main Allied blow would fall at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest sea crossing from Britain. He wanted to keep the elite panzer divisions deep inland, ready to rush to any invasion point and crush the enemy in a decisive counterattack. Rommel, however, had learned a harsh lesson in North Africa. Without air superiority, moving armored divisions in daylight was suicide. He was convinced the Allies had to be defeated on the beaches, on the very first day. He argued passionately to move the panzers closer to the coast, ready to strike the moment the first Allied soldier set foot on French soil. He famously said, "The war will be won or lost on the beaches. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive." The debate raged, and Hitler's compromise pleased no one. Some panzers were given to Rommel, while others remained under von Rundstedt's control, far from the coast. And to make matters worse, many of them could only be deployed with Hitler's personal authorization. The forces Rommel had at his disposal were a mixed bag. The once mighty Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was stretched thin, fighting a desperate war on the Eastern Front and defending German cities from relentless Allied bombing raids. The Atlantic coast was left with barely any air cover. On the ground, morale was a serious issue. Many of the divisions manning the Atlantic Wall were not elite combat units. They were often composed of older men, wounded veterans recovering from the brutal fighting in Russia, or even conscripts from occupied territories, so-called Osttroppen or Eastern troops, who had little loyalty to the German cause. These men were thrown into the defensive line, often poorly equipped and with minimal training, to face the best the Allies had to offer. Rommel did his best with what he had. He was a whirlwind of energy, driving up and down the coast, inspecting defenses and demanding improvements. He ordered the planting of millions of mines, the construction of countless concrete bunkers, and the installation of devious obstacles on the beaches, designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. At places like Utah Beach, he even had the low-lying fields behind the coast deliberately flooded, turning them into impassable swamps to trap paratroopers. He was applying the hard-won lessons from the Allied landings at Salerno, Italy, trying to turn the coastline into a death trap. Then came the perfect storm of unfortunate timing. In early June 1944, the weather in the English Channel was terrible. The forecast predicted storms and high seas for days. Convinced that no invasion was possible in such conditions, Erwin Rommel decided to take a quick trip home to Germany to celebrate his wife Lucy's 50th birthday on June 6. He also planned to meet with Hitler to plead his case for control of the panzer divisions one last time. It was a fateful decision. As Rommel traveled, the weather window the Allies had been waiting for briefly opened. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, the invasion began. The first sign of trouble for the Germans was the sound of thousands of aircraft engines. Allied paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne began dropping behind the German lines, tasked with seizing key bridges and crossroads to disrupt any counterattacks. But the initial German response was confused. Many senior officers were away from their posts, attending war games in Rennes. When reports of paratroopers came in, von Rundstedt dismissed them. He believed it was a diversion, a feint to draw his reserves away from the real target, the Pas-de-Calais. He didn't even bother to wake Rommel's chief of staff. The critical first hours were lost to indecision and miscalculation. Then, as the sun began to rise, the true scale of the invasion became horrifyingly clear. A German artillery officer, Major Werner Plescat, peered through his binoculars from a bunker overlooking what would soon be called Omaha Beach. He couldn't believe his eyes. The horizon was filled with ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of them. "It's the invasion," he reported over the phone, his voice filled with disbelief. "This is it. There are so many of them. So many. I can't even count them." For many German soldiers along the coast, that moment seeing the endless Allied armada stretching to the horizon was the moment they knew the war was lost. The naval bombardment that followed was like nothing the world had ever seen. Thousands of tons of shells from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers rained down on the German positions. The concrete bunkers shook, the ground trembled, and the air was filled with smoke, dust, and the deafening roar of explosions. For the men huddled inside, it was a vision of hell. Despite the shock and the overwhelming firepower, the German defenders fought back, often with incredible tenacity. On Omaha Beach, the well-sited bunkers of the veteran 352nd Infantry Division poured devastating machine gun and mortar fire onto the American troops struggling through the surf. The beach became a killing field, and for a few desperate hours, it looked as if the Germans might actually throw the Americans back into the sea. But the odds were impossible. The Germans had almost no air support. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. They were outnumbered and outgunned at every turn. On Gold Beach, the British landed and overwhelmed the defenses in about an hour. On Juno Beach, the Canadians fought their way ashore and pushed deeper inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day. Even where the defenses were strongest, the Allies brought terrifying new weapons to bear. Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers, known as crocodiles, spewed liquid fire into the narrow firing slits of the bunkers. Naval destroyers sailed daringly close to shore to provide direct fire support. White phosphorus shells were used to burn out resistance nests. For the soldiers trapped inside the concrete tombs, there was no escape. They faced a choice: surrender, or be burned alive. By the end of June 6th, the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impenetrable fortress, had been decisively breached. While pockets of resistance held out, the Allies had secured their beachheads. In Berlin, the initial reaction was one of disbelief, followed by misplaced optimism. Hitler, who was only woken late in the morning, was reportedly pleased. He believed the invasion was exactly what he wanted: a chance to finally engage the Allies and destroy them. He confidently told his generals, "The news couldn't be better. Let them come. We will push them back into the sea." But it was a delusion. The German leadership had underestimated everything: the timing of the landings, the chosen location at Normandy, the sheer number of Allied troops, and the overwhelming material advantage they possessed. The panzer divisions they had held back were now being savaged by Allied fighter bombers as they tried to move towards the front. It was exactly as Rommel had predicted. For the German soldiers on the ground, D-Day was a catastrophe. They had been thrown into an impossible fight against an enemy with limitless resources. They had fought from their bunkers with determination, but they were ultimately sacrificed by a high command that was divided, delusional, and completely out of touch with reality. The Allied foothold in Normandy was more than just a military victory. It was the beginning of the final chapter of the Second World War in Europe, a chapter that would end less than a year later in the ruins of Berlin. Thanks for watching. If you found this perspective on D-Day interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden stories from history. See you next time.